Welcome to this edition of Northwest Real Estate Forum. I'm your host, Patricia Wangsness. Our passion is to help you understand the art, science, and timing of real estate by bringing you relevant topics and experts with up-to-date information impacting your biggest asset, your home. Our guest today is Stacey Romberg. Stacey is a Seattle attorney and has practiced law for over 20 years. She's concentrating in business law, estate planning, and probate. Stacey is a graduate of both Idaho State University and of the University of Idaho for law. She graduated cum laude. Stacey is currently a Washington State Bar Association member in the real property, probate, trust section, animal rights, and in the business law section. Welcome, Stacey.
Hi, Patricia. Thanks for having me today.
Terrific. So, we talked about a lot of things before we started, and one of the things that I want to start with is, can you give our listeners an idea of exactly what you mean by real property, probate, and trusts?
Definitely. It's important to have an understanding of what those terms are. Real property is the obvious thing, first of all, that everyone thinks of, which is land, the dirt, and then the permanent structures that are affixed to that land, such as a house. But the way lawyers also think of real property tends to be a little more expansive. And when we were in law school, we all learned about having real property was, in essence, a bundle of rights, literally a bundle of sticks. And if you allow me to pretend that pens are a bundle of rights, I can illustrate what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Say, for example, that you have a neighbor, and the neighbor's unable to access the road unless they travel through your property, and you decide that you want to grant your neighbor an easement. So here are all the rights related to your property, and you give your neighbor one right, which is the easement, but you retain all the rest of the rights. Or for another example, if you're fortunate enough to have some sort of oil or other mineral rights that are found on your property, and you decide that you want to sell those rights to another company, you can go ahead and sell oil or mineral rights. So again, here's your bundle of rights, and you're giving one right away, but you're still retaining the ultimate title and ownership to your property. So really there are a number of different rights associated with real property, and you can parcel out a variety of them while still retaining ownership.
So that's what the real property bundle is. It's not just the house or the land, it's all the other things that go with it.
Exactly,
okay.
Exactly. And in terms of the second part of your question, which was the definition of probate and trust, if I can step back from that question briefly, basically what we're talking about here is how you administer someone's estate when they die. And there are three ways to do that. The first way is what I'm going to call the bad way, which is if someone literally does nothing. They have no will, they have no trust, they have nothing. And in that instance, your estate is going to be distributed by what's known as the laws of intestate succession, which is a formula that's dictated by the Revised Code of Washington, or the RCWs. And nobody wants that. So the second scenario, which is a better one, is if someone has a will. And if someone has a will, then ultimately when that person dies, their estate is going to go through probate. And here in Washington, we're very fortunate because we have some of the most abbreviated, streamlined probate procedures in the United States. So that means that our Washington probates tend to be quicker and tend to be cheaper than in most places in the country. But nonetheless, probate is a process, and it's a court process. So that means that in order for a personal representative, the person who's appointed in the will to administer the estate, in order for that person to have the authority to act, they have to be appointed by a judge. And provided that it's a good will that's written by a lawyer and they have non-intervention powers, then after that appointment, they can pretty much go ahead and do what they need to do for the estate without continuing to go back to the court to ask permission for their actions. So that's what probate is in general. And in terms of trust, that's the third way that an estate can be administered. And that's when someone has a living trust. And in that case, their assets are ultimately going to be distributed pursuant to the terms of that trust.
Okay. So when somebody goes to make a will, what would be the considerations they would have when they wanted to have probate versus a trust? What would be those considerations where they would say one is better than the other, or just give us an example of when it would be better to choose one over the other?
Oh, I'd be happy to. And there's actually, and we've discussed this a little bit before, there's a discrepancy in the Washington bar. And probably the majority position, which is the position that I tend to adhere to, is that because, again, our probate proceedings are so streamlined, that a will tends to be appropriate for most clients. However, there is a strong minority position that tends to favor living trust in virtually all instances. And one example of a situation where I would definitely recommend to a client that they obtain a living trust involves real property. And say, for example, a client came to me and they have a house in Kirkland, but they also have a condo in Sun Valley, and they have property on Maui, etc. And what would happen if they had a will and that person died is that they'd have to go through what's called an ancillary probate, which is in essence an abbreviated probate proceeding in all of the states where that real property is located. So you can see, say if they have 5 different real properties and they have to have 5 different ancillary probates, that can start to be really expensive and a hassle. And in that instance, I would definitely recommend to the clients that they have a living trust, because that would help lower the expense and the hassle of administering those real properties when they die.
So if everything is in Washington State, you're fine. But if you happen to have things in other states, you would definitely want to have them have a trust.
That's an example of...
That's one example.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And so the last question is, when somebody's... what's the difference between selling property in probate versus a traditional sale? So somebody passes away, they have a will, they're not in a trust, it's probate versus, what are those considerations versus before, if they sold it before they died?
That's a great question, Patricia, because there are a lot of differences in those two contexts. And particularly, in a probate situation, keep in mind that, again, it is a judicial proceeding, you're dealing with family members and other heirs, and people don't necessarily always agree. And so it's really important, because a lot of times the real estate is the biggest asset of the person that died, that there's communication with the family, and that the real estate agent, the attorney, and the personal representative, you're all communicating in terms of, this is what we need to do to prepare this property for sale. This is the sales price. This is why we're pricing the property the way it is. Because you want to keep things moving forward, and you don't want to have a lot of hassles between the family members and fighting about these kind of things. And talking is the best way to avoid that.
Well, having dealt with those kinds of situations, I think your advice of communication is very well given. Hopefully people will heed it. And you have given us so much information today. I have to have you back so that we can delve into them more. So thank you so much for coming.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching this edition of Northwest Real Estate Forum. Whether you are buying, selling, or sitting on the sidelines, keep watching for important information on topics that are impacting your biggest asset, your home. To learn more about this and other shows, please visit us at northwestrealestateforum.com. While you're there, be sure to order your free copy of the Buyer's Guide and the Seller's Guide for great ideas on how to get the most out of the buying and selling of your home. I'm your host, Patricia Wangsness. See you next time.